Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tackling one of the most consequential puzzles in modern history. We all know that on September 1st, 1939, German troops thrust deep into Poland, plunging the world into a devastating global war. But here's the thing, the true spark for World War II absolutely didn't happen in 1939. It actually ignited the very moment World War I ended, way back in November 1918.
It's kind of a staggering question when you really think about it. How on earth did the war to end all wars lead to an even deadlier conflict just 20 short years later? I mean, a second global catastrophe of that scale doesn't just manifest overnight. As you'll see, it was the result of a slow, deeply interconnected 20-year chain reaction.
To make sense of this global descent, we're going to follow a six-part roadmap. A fragile New World Order, Japan igniting the Pacific, the rise of fascism in Europe, the democracies looking away, Spain's bloody dress rehearsal, and finally, the direct march to global war. Let's dive right in.
Starting with Part 1, A Fragile New World Order. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the grand idea was to resolve disputes by debate rather than fighting. Old empires were completely dismembered, drawing up new borders and new nations all across Europe. But over in Germany, a highly dangerous myth was taking root. The German military pushed this narrative that they hadn't actually been defeated on the battlefield, but rather they'd been betrayed by their own politicians.
And then there's this number, 6.6 billion pounds. Try to wrap your head around that. That was the staggering sum in reparations forced upon the already war-torn German people. This economic devastation, combined with a period of wild hyperinflation in 1923 that literally wiped out ordinary people's life savings, created incredibly fertile ground for extremist politicians. Case in point, a young Adolf Hitler attempted an armed coup in 1923, failed, went to prison, and realized right then and there that he'd have to use the democratic system to seize power instead.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had been championing a brand new League of Nations to keep this fragile global peace intact. But the U.S. Congress wasn't having it. Driven by isolationism, which is basically a refusal to risk getting sucked into another European conflict, they outright rejected the League. So right out of the gate, the world's new referee was severely handicapped because the United States just retreated entirely into its own shell.
Which brings us to Part 2, Japan ignites the Pacific. While America was happily distracted by the wealth and pleasure-seeking of the Roaring '20s, Japan was facing a totally different reality. They had a rapidly exploding population and almost zero natural resources to fuel their booming industries. So the Japanese military turned their eyes toward Chinese Manchuria, a massive land incredibly rich in grain, coal, and minerals.
In 1931, without even bothering to inform their own elected government, Japanese forces just went ahead and seized the Manchurian capital, overran the territory, and set up a puppet state. So how do you think the world responded to this blatant invasion? This was it, the absolute first great test for the League of Nations.
Well, the fatal flaw of this New World Order was exposed for everyone to see. The League universally condemned Japan, and in response, Japan bluntly declared the report impossible to accept, and their delegates literally just walked out. The crucial takeaway here is that the League took zero military or economic action. Nothing. They realized they were completely powerless. Japan became an international pariah, sure, but they essentially got a free pass to continue expanding unchecked.
And that unchecked aggression escalated terribly. By 1937, during a full-scale invasion, the capture of Nanking resulted in an estimated 300,000 civilian deaths in just 6 weeks. Japanese bombers even sank an American gunboat, the Panay, killing 50 crewmen. Yet, terrified of sparking a larger war, the Western democracies flat-out refused to intervene.
So, as the League completely fails in the East, we move to Part 3, Fascism rises in Europe. In the 1920s, Italy was totally paralyzed by strikes, which opened the door for Benito Mussolini to march on Rome and assume dictatorial powers. He stamped out all opposition and built up a modern military. But to understand how Adolf Hitler managed to mirror this kind of absolute power over in Germany, we have to look at the global economy.
6 million. That's how many Germans were left unemployed following the catastrophic U.S. stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression was sweeping the globe. Desperate citizens, facing starvation and utter ruin, started turning away from moderate politicians and looked toward extremists who were promising radical, immediate solutions. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in parliament, and by 1934, Hitler had declared himself the absolute leader, the Führer.
Emboldened by this obvious lack of global pushback, Mussolini decided it was time to carve out his own empire. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia. Mussolini's modern army crushed the local forces, even dropping gas bombs that had been strictly outlawed at Versailles as crimes against humanity. And once again, the League of Nations merely wrung its hands from Switzerland, imposing these incredibly weak economic sanctions that did absolutely nothing.
Now you might be wondering, where were the major powers during all of this? That brings us to part 4, the democracies look away. Both Britain and France were supposed to be the referees of Europe, but they were deeply, deeply traumatized by the horrific casualties of World War I. Their economies were shattered, their global empires were swollen and super expensive to manage, and they simply did not have the stomach for another brutal conflict.
It created a really stark contrast. The fascist powers were pouring millions into massive public works, like Hitler's Autobahn, while secretly undertaking rapid rearmament. Hitler literally tripled the size of his army and built a massive new air force, the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, the Western democracies took a totally defensive posture, actually slashing their military budgets. France built the defensive Maginot Line, and Britain ran its military down to what was basically just a small policing force.
Let's move to Part 5, Spain's bloody dress rehearsal. In 1936, a vicious civil war erupted in Spain between the left-wing Republicans and the right-wing nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco. This conflict effectively became a horrifying, real-world testing ground for the modern weapons that would very soon tear the whole world apart. It was an incredibly complex proxy war. Franco appealed to Hitler and Mussolini, who eagerly poured in over 62,000 troops, the newest panzer tanks, and the ultra-modern Luftwaffe Condor Legion, just to test their new equipment out. On the other side, the Republicans were backed by the Soviet Union and international volunteer brigades. And Britain and France? Well, they declared a highly cynical policy of non-intervention, absolutely terrified of sparking a wider European war. The sheer destructive power of this new technology was put on full, devastating display in April 1937. German and Italian air power was used indiscriminately against civilian targets. The Basque town of Guernica was virtually obliterated by aerial bombing, resulting in 6,000 civilian deaths. This terrifying display of ruthless destruction thoroughly convinced the Western democracies that any resistance to fascist powers would lead to the immediate annihilation of their own cities. And that brings us to our final chapter, Part 6, The March to Global War. With the democracies completely paralyzed by fear and their own internal economic struggles, the time bomb was accelerating. Hitler realized that Britain and France were completely impotent to resist any real pressure, so he began to put his long-term expansionist ambitions into high gear.
Honestly, it's chilling how quickly the pace of unchecked aggression accelerated. In 1936, Hitler reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland. In March 1938, a bloodless invasion annexed his homeland of Austria. By September, he threatened war over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, desperate to avoid a fight, just agreed to let him take it. But then, just 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops marched right in and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Which brings us to one of the most tragic ironies of the 20th century. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from signing that Munich agreement, the one handing over the Sudetenland to Hitler, waving a piece of paper and declaring it guaranteed peace for our time. This policy of appeasement was a catastrophic miscalculation. Giving Hitler what he wanted didn't satisfy him at all, it only guaranteed further destruction.
Now the final obstacle for Hitler was the Soviet Union. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had actually tried to form an alliance with Britain and France, but after negotiations totally stalled out, he made a stunning pivot. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, sworn ideological enemies, shocked the globe by signing a non-aggression pact. Secretly, they agreed to just split Poland right down the middle between them. The final fuse of the powder keg had been lit. Free from the threat of a two-front war, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland just days later.
So an absolutely crucial question remains for us today. We've seen how isolationism, economic depression, ignored global aggression in Manchuria and Abyssinia, and the desperate desire for appeasement all compounded over 2 full decades. If the warning signs were flashing globally for 20 straight years, if the steps toward global war are this traceable, what stops history from repeating itself today? I hope this explainer helped you grasp the fascinating and frankly sobering interconnectedness of these events.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and we'll see you in the next explainer.